There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Psychedelics. Today, I'm joined by Erica Rex and Vincent Verroust. Oh, sorry. How do we do the last name? I didn't ask. I'm sorry.
Vincent Verroust.
Verroust. Great. And we are here today to talk about a bit of French psychedelic history, commentary on the American psychedelic movement a little bit from a French perspective, and I'm very excited. So where do we want to start, Erica? Well, actually, let's start. Erica, can you give yourself a little bit of an intro, and then we'll go to Vincent?
Yes, my name is Erica Rex, and I'm a writer and journalist, and one of the original subjects in the psilocybin clinical trials with Roland Griffiths. And I've written a great deal about this and spoken at the National Institutes of Health, at numerous university gatherings. And I am working on a book about my experience and the real history of psychedelic medicine and the ramifications. And that's me. And do you want me to introduce Vincent, or Vincent, you want to introduce yourself? I think you can introduce yourself.
I could, but it can be pleasurable to hear you present me. Besides,
Okay.
my English is not so perfect, so
It's fine.
learn a lesson.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague and very good contact, Vincent Verroust. And Vincent is the founder and president of the French Psychedelic Society. He works also as a scientific coordinator in charge of the research on psychedelics at the Network of Health Establishments for the Prevention of Addictions. He is also a researcher affiliated with the Centers for Psychiatry, Comorbidities, and Addictions. And he is getting his doctorate from the Center for History, Society, and Science and Conflicts at the University of Picardie, Jules Verne.
And this is supposed to be my main activity. The last thing you mentioned. I'm currently finishing my PhD in epistemology and history of science, and I am working on French archives about the discovery of the psilocybin mushrooms in the 50s.
I was very excited when I realized you were a historian of science. It's really good. I'm excited about that. We don't have enough of that. I'm excited. So where do we want to start? Do we want to start about like where did psychedelics start in France, or how do we want to approach this?
That's a good question, and it starts before the particular moment where I have some legitimacy to talk, actually, because I think the first psychedelic substance that has been studied by the Western world is, in my opinion, mescaline. And there is a lot of research on mescaline in Europe from the late 19th century and the beginning of the... my English is so bad, but the beginning of the previous century. And I know more about psilocybin mushrooms. But I can say that there have been a wave of psychedelic research and cultural interest into psychedelics in Europe and in France in the beginning of the 20th century, with famous French poet, I don't know if he's very well known outside of France, but Apollinaire, in the beginning of the 20th century, writing about peyote parties in Versailles, near Paris, in around 1918. So, and we also had a pharmacist doing some experiments with peyote, creating medicines with peyote in his how do you call that? In his pharmacist shop around the 20s. So after the First World War. So there is there is a psychedelic history in Europe and in France, that is quite ancient and not so well known, I think.
Hmm. That's
Except by
interesting.
maybe specialists like Mike J, who wrote a super book about psychedelics. And outside of those authors, I don't see often the European history on psychedelics quite mentioned.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So
I believe I read some mention of iboga showing up in pharmacies in the early 1900s as well, but
mm-mm.
I don't have any citations or references to that. But it's an interesting concept that there was, you know, two or three major compounds floating around France in the first half of the 1900s.
Yeah, actually, you're right of mentioning iboga. I always forget to to mention that. But I think if we want to be really precise, the first psychedelics to ever be mentioned by European observers might be cohoba. As soon as the Europeans discovered America, the use of hallucinogenic snuffs have been observed as soon as 15th century, but
Hmm.
observed but not quite studied to my knowledge. I hope some historical work can be done to know more about the discovery of cohoba and those zemi statuettes. There are plenty in museums, and I think it is the first contact between psychedelics and the Western European world. But
Hmm.
again, this is not my area of expertise, if I have one. uh, but yeah, I think the history of psychedelics is a little bit more wide than what is usually presented in major books of or other discussions. And yes, that leaves room for historians to share their knowledge.
Hmm. Beautiful. So let's see. In terms of French involvement with early psilocybin cubensis or Mexicana research,
Mhm.
what was going on? Were there people exploring these substances in Mexico?
Yes, there were. Actually, the modern interest into hallucinogenic mushrooms, I think, can be dated to the work of the Wassons. You know, of course, there have been some mention of inebriating mushrooms before the Wassons during the beginning of the 20th century. Blas Pablo Rico or Saint-Tesson or these other authors. But I think the real work starts with the Wassons, Gordon Wasson and his spouse Valentina Wasson. But those amateur ethnomycologists, they were friends with Roger Haim, who was a French mycologist, and they were friends with him even before they got interested into the Mesoamerican zone.
Can I interject one thing? She was the mycologist. Her name was Valentina Pavlovna. She was a Russian who had done mycology before she even came to Europe. She was the mushroom gatherer, and she got him interested in it. And it was actually her idea after seeing some of the first studies just for what do you call it, psychomimetic studies, that this was possibly a therapeutic device. That came from her. She was a pediatrician by training. Just needed to add that.
Erica,
Absolutely.
timeline-wise, where does this fit with the LSD developments and like early LSD experimentation?
LSD was was actually developed very soon after the discovery of serotonin, because and it was LSD is an ergot derivative. An ergot is a fungus that grows on the rye plant and barley too. I think Claviceps purpurea, and it was they were looking for vasoconstrictors, and it was found to be and I was just looking at this yesterday, in the 30s and 40s, a vasoconstrictor that was an antagonist to serotonin, which had been discovered. And so, but it was also realized it was hallucinogenic, that it had these properties, that several of these ergot alkaloids had vasoconstrictive properties. Some would kill you, and some were vasoconstrictive and hallucinogenic, and that was LSD. So it started out as one thing and then developed these other properties. So you could say it goes back to the 30s.
Interesting. Yeah, and I guess legend has it Hoffman consumed in 43, and Gordon Wasson did his first expedition in 55 or so with Valentina. Was Valentina there on that trip?
I think
so.
Yes. And I
That's
think
how I
the
understand it.
first trip was in 53.
Okay.
Second trip in 55, if I'm correct.
Great.
So psilocybin has been discovered after LSD. Yes, maybe we can say more about this discovery, because at first the Wassons, they weren't really interested into hallucinogenic mushrooms. They were interested they were interested by the knowledge and the uses of mushrooms by peoples across the globe and across history. Not particularly about inebriating mushrooms, but because their editor and friends of them, poet Robert Graves, they draw their attention to the Mesoamerican zone. They went to discover that there was something about mushrooms in ancient Mexico, and discovering that there were samples of inebriating mushrooms at Harvard Herbarium, collected in the specific village of Huautla de Jimenez in the 30s by famous ethnobotanist Robert Evan Schultes. So they started to become interested into this particular zone, and learning that a missionary was there in Huautla de Jimenez, they could get some information about the use of an inebriating mushrooms in this area. The missionary was named Eunice Pike, and she confirmed the Wasson that people there in this village believed in the power of a mushroom to heal, or more precisely, to know if an ill person will live or die. So everything is explained in Wasson's book, Mushrooms, Russia, and History. And that's why they started their field, their investigations in the field. And as soon as they collected samples of mushrooms, they sent them, not in Basel, as I see in every book written in English, but in Paris, actually, to their mycologist friend, Roger Heim, whose archives I'm working on. And this is this French mycologist, Heim.
She was, can I interject one detail? That he was the director of the Museum of Natural History for a long time. And he was very influential in the scientific world and the history of science in France. Very important figure.
Not exactly in the history of science, but he is actually one of the founder of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So he's one of the first, at least in France, person to ring the bell about ecological crisis. He wrote the forewords of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. And so, yes, it was the head of the French National Museum of Natural History, which he reformed to how do you say, to make the biologists care about conservancy. He's really a pioneer in environmentalism in France. But he was also a great name in mycology at this time, and of course, the ethnomycological studies of the Wassons really interested him. Not particularly the hallucinogenic part of it, but as soon as they collected samples in Mexico, they sent them to him, who identified or named the species collected. Identify for those species that were already known to science, but without the knowledge that they were psychotropic, or named for the new species, Psilocybe mexicana in particular. And of course, as soon as the samples were collected, they tried to cultivate them, which was not so easy at the time. Now, cubensis, Psilocybe cubensis is quite easy to grow, but at that time it was not so easy to find out how to cultivate them. Apparently, there have been some attempts in the US and in other parts of the world, but the know-how is it how you say, the savoir-faire?
Know-how, yes.
There's a know-how of Roger Haim assistant, Roger Cailleux, was decisive to be able to cultivate those mushrooms. And it was really important to find out how to cultivate them in order to identify the active compound. And as Erica correctly said, the compound should have been discovered in Paris, actually.
It was. They had a bottle of it.
Yes, but the chemical identification of the compound has been realized in Basel, because the French mycologists sent the samples to Switzerland, because the French chemist named Marcel Frère-Jacques, he didn't really want to study these mushrooms. He was too, because the head of the museum of natural history asked him to identify the active compound, but he took time to start this research, and by a clumsy gesture, he dropped the flask on the floor, which infuriated Roger Haim, the mycologist, and knowing that 15 years before, a hallucinogenic substance had been discovered in Basel by studying the alkaloids of another mushroom or fungi, he had the idea to send mushrooms in Basel. That's why it is in Switzerland that psilocybin have been discovered. But to discover the active compound, they had to learn how to grow the mushrooms. And this is where the expertise of French mycologists have been decisive, because there are a lot of letters between France and Switzerland about how to correctly cultivate those mushrooms. And in the process of this cultivation, they discovered that most of the species could produce what is known currently as truffles. And this is those truffles, which are active, of course, that allowed the easiest identification of the active compound. And as soon as psilocybin was identified and named, and as soon as Sandoz could produce crystalline psilocybin to be used in humans, the first trials started in Paris. So we have a rich psilocybin history, psilocybin research history, and I'm happy to to share it today on Psychedelics Today, because in my opinion, the history of psychedelics is really Americano-centered. Can you say that? Is it understandable? But this is currently being challenged by, for example, this publication. It's not advertising exactly, but it's one of the first books that is, expanding Mindscape Global History of Psychedelics, that put a light on other histories of psychedelics. Chinese, Indian, Brazilian. It's less focused on American continent, and I am happy that those kind of discussions are happening now.
Who wrote that book?
It's a collective book directed by historian Erika Dick
Oh,
Mhm.
yes.
and historian Chris
She's
Elcott.
fantastic.
Yeah,
And I want to plug really quick that my orientation comes from Soviet Prague. So I've always had the European orientation via Grof and LSD. So I've always wanted to challenge the American history as well.
Excellent.
but it's a transnational history, and yeah, from the beginning, except for LSD maybe, but no, not really. It's
They
transnational.
sent it all over.
Yes, of
Mhm.
course.
Yeah. And yeah, Greek influence, I suppose, or whatever. Yeah, it's interesting.
Mhm.
So was there a history of clinical trials and, research in hospitals and just the general experimentation in France?
You haven't read my book.
Not yet. Not yet.
Yes, that was where the first clinical trials were done. The first.
Yes,
Full
we are
stop.
speaking about psilocybin.
Yes, psilocybin.
The psilocybin clinical trials. Okay,
Yes.
we'll be clear.
Yes, because there have also been clinical trials on LSD,
Right.
and my friend and colleague Zoe Dubus knows a lot about this. I think you should invite her. She has a lot to share about LSD research in France. And before that, before the Second World War, there have been trials with mescaline too.
Mhm.
But the first trials with psilocybin are quite interesting. I mean, those who happened in France, because it didn't really work well.
And there were certainly pre-war mescaline clinical trials in Germany. I know of one around phantom limb pain and things like that. So it's a really interesting, robust history for sure.
Yes, and in the Germanic world, a lot of studies on mescaline, also in Romania, in Central Europe. It's not really well known.
I did not know about Romania.
Yes, yes.
They mostly use them. It was as a psychomimetic. They were trying to imitate what they felt to be were states of mental illness, primarily. Some were just observational, blood pressure, heart rate, that kind of thing. But
cool. So basic science, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Also, the trials of DMT in Hungary are quite fascinating.
Forgot about that. Yes, that's a big one.
But it's a pity that the trials with psilocybin in France are not so exciting because it didn't work really well. Actually, it is interesting to learn how not to use psilocybin.
And LSD, I might add. The LSD stories were even more gruesome. They were quite bad. There were examples, actually, of trials with LSD where there was one case where they were trying to convert some homosexual lovers to be, they were doing, what is it called when they're trying to make them not be homosexual any longer?
Conversion therapy.
Conversion therapy, right. And that was LSD, and that was in the 50s. And,
which let's totally be clear that this is like kind of the norm in psychiatry at the time. This was just one compound that was being applied to the norm in a somewhat gruesome way. Yeah, for sure. Not great.
I think also Timothy Leary spoke about LSD as a potential drug for treating homosexuality.
Yeah, I think most people who were excited at the time probably believed the same thing, as it was a, disorder at the time.
Yeah, that paper was published. I have it someplace. It's in French.
Yeah. We should damn all of psychiatry, not just
it's
a few in that era, at least. Yeah.
in most areas.
But they concluded. So I'm speaking about French earliest psilocybin research on the therapeutic interest of psilocybin. But I think they saw more diagnostical interest. Is my English correct? It was
Yeah.
interesting because it kind of exacerbated the clinical.
Those were between 56 and 58. The clinical, that's like
starting in 58, because
58?
psilocybin, starting in 58.
So, psychomimetic studies were they call them psychomimetic. They're trying to find out what the symptoms are, or create symptoms, or torture people into having symptoms so that they can say this is how the symptom is and this is what it means.
Actually, in France, we have our own word, which is psychodyspeptic.
Oh, okay.
It was coined by Delay, Jean Delay, and his colleague Pierre Deniker. Apparently, it was from a military command to know more about chemicals, how to use chemicals for military, maybe warfare, or I don't know.
It was for advanced interrogation techniques. They were trying to find out if they could use it as an interrogation tool.
So they had to classify psychotropic drugs, and the class that contain LSD, psilocybin, mescaline has been named psychodyspeptic, which means disturber of the mind. So, but those trials with psilocybin, not the military ones, because I don't have any idea if there have been, but the clinical trials in Hospital Sainte-Anne in Paris, they gave psilocybin to almost any case of for any indication, and even sometimes on the first day of arrival in the hospital, so without any preparation. Usually the doses were quite low, around 10 milligrams, and it raised the symptoms. So it was useful for diagnostic, but has to cure people. The symptoms decreased only during the time of the experiment, or maybe a few days after, except in a few cases, in particular the case of a woman suffering from anorexia.
She did not last after she got home. Did you read the rest of that study?
Yes, of course. 1 year after she relapsed.
Back in the hospital. She couldn't stay in the,
But 1 year after. There have been 2 publications about this person. The first one concludes of unquestionable therapeutic effect. And yes, we have her own account of the experience. What's interesting is, let's explain how this particular clinical case. So she was suffering from depression and anorexia, and she was really thin. Can you say that? She was under chlorpromazine, so a neuroleptic, and they gave her an injection of psilocybin, 10 milligrams. It's quite a low dose, but maybe her body weight was so low that it had a big effect. And they left her alone in her room, listening to the radio, probably some classical music. She had the impressions of angels coming, playing the flute for her. And it gave her the inspiration to write some poems of spiritual significance. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find the poems or to read them, but at least we have the titles, which are really in the semantic field of spirituality and Christianity. So the day after, she said to the doctors, "What did you give me?" I had a kind of interesting experience, and she showed them the poems and told them that angels came and played me some flute. So wow. So they removed the chlorpromazine and they gave her a second injection, and this time they stayed with her, and she could have a quite strong experience where she experienced the her memory, the memories of her traumatic things that happened in her youth came back to her, and she could explain exactly why she was suffering. So it had a huge therapeutic effect, even though it didn't last more than a year.
Well, it was a year that she was readmitted, so they don't really know exactly when she relapsed. So she was very anorexic again after a year. She
was at least depressed after a year. We don't
Yeah.
know if she was anorexic again.
Mm.
Actually, the thesis is just behind me. If you leave me 1 second, I can find
That's
it.
okay.
But I have a paper about this case, which is translated into English if some people are interested into this particular case study. Another case study is catatonic person that momentarily gains the ability to speak again, which really impressed the physicians. But again, it didn't last very long. But I have some letters between him and the doctors in, we have a catatonic person that have been able to speak again under psilocybin. But finally, it was not an easy drug to use. And since the same team discovered Lagactyl medicine, a neuroleptic, which was really useful to make everybody calm in the psychiatric hospital. This was a huge scientific and industrial success, and psilocybin was not so effective. So even before the prohibition, they stopped giving psilocybin and focused more on neuroleptic therapies. So the decline of psilocybin in France is linked to the success of neuroleptics and the difficulty to use the substance more than because of the prohibition or a moral panic or something else. So the last sign of trial with psilocybin in France that I found is around 63, and the prohibition is in 66. And now it's a renaissance time in France too. But we are late in comparison to our neighbors.
So I'm curious to start talking about the critique of the American implementation and some things you and Erica noticed. Erica started bringing this topic to me by saying France is a very secular nation, which may be true. My understanding was
it is
Catholicism is a birthright there, which is like what are we doing? But I don't know, Erica. You guys can jump in there. Explain it to me.
Allez-y.
I speak. I thought it was.
Well, I can. Well, I mean, I can speak, but I have to qualify this from being, American who lived there for 8 years. But yes, Catholicism is the largest religion, but it's very, very separate from daily life and from the political life, and it's and every other religion equally. It's not. So.
How do you say atheism? When you don't believe in God.
Yes, atheism.
Atheism is way stronger than Catholicism in France.
Yes.
Let's be clear.
There's very, and the emphasis on secularity in terms of we don't bring our religious feelings, practices, appearances, symbols into the workplace, into the public sphere, into the medical sphere, into
at schools,
any place, universities, nowhere. So, and certainly not when we talk about how just the language around psychedelics is this Anglo-Saxon way of talking about these experiences of seeing God or seeing the face of God or seeing the divine, are not really acceptable ways of describing the experience
Or
in
it would
trance.
be pathologized, I think.
Yes, it would be a sign that you were having some kind of yeah.
Yes,
So
illusions or.
yeah.
Actually, one day I organized with some colleagues a meeting in a hospital in a palliative care unit or a psycho-oncology unit, just to inform them that there are some trials on the cancer patients. And we made a PowerPoint. I said, okay, this is a study in New York, this study in Baltimore. And we put some pictures of the trials at Johns Hopkins, where you see a person lying down with the headphones, and there is this little statuette of the Buddha. And this is the particular detail that where all the doctors are, oh no, if we do this, we remove the Buddha. Why is there a statue? It was really a strong reaction that I observed. And I think they are right. You don't put a Buddha statuette in a room where you do a treatment, unless the person is Buddhist and asked for it, the patient, I guess. But it's not to the team to put a Buddha. I don't know. What do you think, Joe, if you're in the US, America?
Like Buddhism is like, it's so complicated because at the same time as it's like a deist religion, it can also be quite atheistic as a religion. So it's complicated. But I would agree with you that it's not necessarily appropriate to have in there for everybody, because what if somebody's, God is Liverpool or like Manchester United, right? Like maybe we have Manchester United stuff everywhere instead of a Buddha. But it should be probably up to the client, the patient, what's in there. I like a very soft, comfortable, no symbol environment myself, because symbols carry a lot of meaning and can trigger a lot of things, for sure. Any kind of symbol, and that could be language too. You say the right thing, like a lightly veiled biblical reference, and that could send somebody in a really weird spiral given their relationship to religious texts of certain kinds. That's my opinion.
Well, that of course then is the was one of the big problems, I have to say, with the Hopkins playlist. It was ecclesiastical through and through.
Really?
It was
Always?
Yes, it was hugely ecclesiastical. It
Erica,
was
the one
church
thing I
music.
always bring up is just how many anti-Semitic composers were included often in this,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
for Jewish people, like how much that would trigger for them.
It was
Um,
it was astonishing the kinds of selections they made, and I know why they made them, unfortunately. And I did challenge them on them, of course. I mean, I was a thorn in their side in many respects. Um, but I should mention, and actually Vincent was the one who drew my attention to this, so that an extreme example of something that was very offensive both to him and myself was a clip from a film that was made it came out in 2017. It was one of the psilocybin movies, that were kind of made in little clutches. And A New Understanding, the Science of Psilocybin, it's called. So if someone wants to look it up. And one of the things they had in there, in some ways it was very informative. It's not a very long film. I think it's an hour or something, hour and a half. There's a scene, they filmed or allowed to, the subject allowed the film from her session. I believe she was in the same study I was, in fact.
I think it's a healthy volunteer.
A healthy volunteer. Oh, okay.
It's a
She was a
healthy
healthy
volunteer,
volunteer.
and
Okay.
it's maybe a follow-up interview.
With her.
Yes.
Okay. Right. So she wasn't in a study. That's good. A healthy volunteer that had a session with Bill Richards, who was one of the pioneers of using psychedelics as therapeutic medicine long before it was banned. When they were using it with just tremendous regularity in the clinic, in the psychiatric clinic at Spring Grove Clinic in Maryland. And there were, I mean, their estimates between 10 and 40,000 doses were administered over the course of 10 years at least to psychiatric patients. It was a medicine. It was never FDA approved, but they used it to effect. And then that was all shut down. So he didn't, have jobs per se for very many years, but he's on the faculty at Johns Hopkins. And so he ran this session, and during the session, do you want to describe it, Vincent? It might be better if you do, because I was so annoyed by it that I'm not.
The volunteer, who's a lady in her 60s, I think, so she explains that she was having kind of a mystical experience with how do you call this,
eye mask.
the eye mask.
Yeah.
And the sitter, Bill Richards, he asked her to remove the eye mask, and
she was just interject. She was talking about having had a sense of God, that he had asked her specifically a question about God, and she was breathing and her breath and God, and she was under the covers, and he asked her to remove. So go ahead.
And then he shows her a picture of her husband. And now she has this really pleasurable experience of being married to her husband in while having a very strong spiritual experience. And she was really happy to have this experience. But as a viewer of the movie, I was shocked. Why would you show a picture of this person's husband while she's having a very strong psilocybin experience, and it might interfere with her life so strongly? Maybe her husband is a very nice person, and that's not the problem. But what if he was not? And what if she just were to fall in love with somebody else? Or I don't know. But it's very strong interference between one's private and personal life and a clinical trial where you just try to figure out what this particular compound does on people. I think that is very unethical, but who am I to criticize such a known researcher? But
so we
as a person,
discussed it internally, and they're in our company, because we've been critiquing this stuff for a while. And the one issue is the lack of context, but that's also part of the problem with the film, I suppose.
maybe
is showing something so that you could react against so strongly without context, right? And like perhaps they had a robust conversation for weeks before that. I have no idea. Probably not, is my guess. But it's interesting. And religion in America is so weird. It's such a big, strange topic. So who knows? But go ahead, Vincent.
No, I think I said the main thing that I wanted to share. I was shocked, actually, that you could interfere with a person's experience with a picture of her husband.
In my experience, like that's really goes against how I've been trained in all of my experience to actually get that active in the process. There's this debate between active work in sessions and the self-directed approach, which would be more a Groff approach. And there's a lot of tension between the two camps, if I'm being honest. So it's a really interesting thing that they were so active, right, in that session.
Yes, we lack the context, because it's really strange to have a picture of her husband at hand. Why is that? Yes, we should know more.
Well, in the trial, you're encouraged to bring photos and little artifacts with you if you want to have them to refer to or make yourself feel comfortable. So if she had brought it herself, certainly. But then the question is, if she brought it herself and she wanted to refer to it, then that would be up to her. It was right there for her to have, if she would want it. But anyway.
But as to the way psilocybin was given in France in the 50s, it was not any better.
Right.
That's for sure. So what would be the good way? What music should we play? Should we play music? I don't know. I have been following a training in Switzerland in Geneva Hospital, where they do not propose a musical playlist to the patients. It's up to them to bring music if they want. But that's not a very good strategy either, I think, because I know of a patient that brought the same playlist as Imperial College playlist, but he didn't really like the music, so he kept skipping the tracks during 2 hours, and he kind of ruined his own experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen people spend their whole session trying to modify their playlist, and it's like it's kind of missing the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say we need a lot more time spent on music research in psychedelics. I'm not satisfied with where we stand right now, and I hope others are not as well. We need to evolve quite a bit. And Mendel Kalin's done some interesting work with wave paths, but I don't think that's perfect. But I think it's a good tool because it's AI generated based on samples. I can't really call it music though, as such. I can call it, like, I've used it for a few sessions. It's okay, but it's not amazing in my opinion. But hopefully it keeps evolving, and I hope there's other tools coming as well to help with this. I think it's a nice thing to help keep you inside and project against. I would prefer the clients projecting against the music than me, as you know. So yeah, if you don't like it, maybe look at why you don't like it and lean into that. That would be my approach. Yeah, or make that annoyance bigger or something like that. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we hit our major points. Was there any other kind of super high points we wanted to make sure we got in today?
I was hoping to that Vincent would talk a little bit about the DMT for alcohol abuse disorder studies that you're trying to get started or have gotten started.
Yes, with pleasure. Actually, it's 5-MeO-DMT.
5-MeO, excuse me.
That we are considering.
Yeah.
So I am working with a team of addictologists in Hospital Paul Brousse in south of Paris. And believe me or not, but 5-MeO-DMT is not illegal in France. You lose your head for that. And one of the difficulties to conduct trials with controlled substance in France is paperwork. It is doable, but there is a lot of paperwork. And I think 5-MeO-DMT have several advantages. It is short acting, and it is not on the list of illegal substances, so maybe less paperwork. And from a logistic point of view, it will be easier for patients to have the experience, and maybe more patients, and of course, because it's a shorter duration, it is more convenient. So we are working on a protocol. I think we could be able to synthesize our own product, because it will be hard to import, because it might be illegal where I think abroad. So there is a project going on. I cannot say a lot because it's still in the writing moments, not exactly operational moments, but I hope I can share more once it is started. But last summer, a person died in a pseudo-shamanic session in France. He was on mushrooms and he had been given 5-MeO-DMT. It turns out he had some cardiac problems, so he died. And I'm afraid at some point 5-MeO-DMT could be forbidden too.
It's the combination of those two that have that would have the enormous effect. It would cause the tremendous lability. One alone, probably not, or one and then the other taken a long time afterwards, but together
On a person with cardiac problems.
with the cardiac problems, yes.
So yes, it brings the topic of excluding patients with particular conditions. So yes.
We'll see. Regulators sometimes take science into account, and other times do not.
Don't usually.
But I hope they don't watch me sharing the fact that it's not forbidden, because
they'll stick it on the schedule instantly then, right?
But we're not so good in English in France, so hopefully
let's keep it that way. And I think I know where my next European vacation is, so can't wait. So I want to thank you both for being here. Do you want to mention any of your websites or books or anything that might be coming forward soon from you?
Erica, after you.
Well, I hope that my book is published soon, and when it is, I'll have a website for it. At the moment, it exists mostly in pieces that are up around the web in various places, and in the manuscript and in the inboxes of editors. So that's where it stands now.
You've got a few articles at Psychedelics Today that are great.
That's right, yeah. And I'm going to do another one, which we have talked about at length, the planaria, that the mind, that the planaria actually worm, once his head is cut off, he still remembers how to do it, a very modest trick that a worm can do with no head. And when he regrows the head, because they regrow it, they are capable of reproducing the same behavior. So it brings to the question of mind and brain. The brain is not the mind. So.
Erica, I love this. This was my gateway into the movement, was this book Holographic Mind by Michael Talbot, which really kind of plays with this theory.
And actually, I have a chapter in this book. So if you're interested in it,
oh great!
And my chapter is about the mycologist Roger Haim having his rationality shaken by his own experiments with psilocybin and his encounter with Maria Sabina, because he has been forced to acknowledge the divinatory power of psilocybin. And as a rationalist person who couldn't believe in divination, he started to doubt, and he couldn't really share this with his scientist colleagues. So I had to... This is something I discovered by reading his correspondence and some interviews he gave. So it is between... It is about the tension between his rationality and the fact that he has been forced to consider the existence or not of parapsychology. So it might interest people, I hope. It was really fascinating to me to work on this particular topic. And please have a look at it if you're interested into how...
Can you hold that book up again so that I...
Of course. Expanding My Escapes.
Okay.
A Global History of Psychedelics. I think it's a very interesting book with a lot of interesting chapters.
And I would encourage everybody to read more history in psychedelics and otherwise, because a lot of the arguments being made these days are quite ignorant of the history, generally speaking. So please continue to get educated, everybody. And yeah, let's keep trying to develop this interesting project we have on our hands. All right. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate your time, and I hope we can do more.
Thank you
very much, Joe. Thank you.